Thanks for joining us here. I'm supposed to have a slide up which says who my panelists are, but thankfully I wrote down all of their names and titles, so I'm going to just introduce them from left to right. Anders Rosengren from Ericsson, Yoshihiro Nakajima from Docomo, Geza Sox from Nokia, and Diego Lopez from Telefonica. So I have two of the world's leading systems vendors on the stage and two of the world's leading network operators on the stage. I thought it'd be really good to mix it up a little bit, right? So we hear the operator view and we hear the vendor view. Actually, I call you guys technology suppliers. It feels more kind of upbeat to talk about technology suppliers. Vendors, it seems like a machine where you get Coke out of the thing, right? So we've done a little bit of planning on how we're going to answer these questions and in what order. And if we've got some time, I hope we will get some time. I'm sure many of you are going to have questions that you're going to want to ask these guys, right? It's a great panel. You've got Yoshi's flown all the way over from Japan for this panel and for the conference. And so it's a really good opportunity to figure out what's really going on out there in the field. Okay. So let's begin. I'm going to start with Diego. Diego, tell the audience what the focus and motivation is for Telefónica's NFV deployment.
Well, originally, as in many cases, I guess that when we started 6-7 years ago, was around costs. It was the theory was that having things running on a homogeneous platform would highly reduce capex, and that was something that it was extremely appealing by the moment. Currently, I think that we have matured as the rest of the industry has matured with respect to NFV. And the main motivation right now is precisely about automation and reducing, not reducing complexity, about addressing complexity and being able to deal with it, and shortening the market cycles, and the idea that we will be much more agile in providing services and personalizing them. So basically, automation and shortening the life cycles are right now our main motivations.
Did I hear you say it wasn't about capex reduction?
Well, for sure. No, capex reduction is something that is welcome always, but we have learned that the capex reduction is not as high as we expected. With this, there is nothing wrong with it. You reduce a little bit the capex, but if even with the same cost, you can provide a much better and easier to manage service.
Very good. That's right. Thanks. Yoshi, same question for you for Docomo, NTT Docomo.
Yes, I have a whole big motivation for NFV system. One is capex and opex cost reduction. And second is improve the agility for the service deployment. The third thing is the elastic infrastructure for traffic demand. And fourth, improve the resiliency for the national disaster. So of course, Japan has many earthquakes, and we have to maintain and ensure the connectivity for our customers.
So elasticity and ensuring resilience of your infrastructure.
Yes, of course.
They're the key motivations. But you'd also see capex reduction and opex reduction. Where do you think the capex reduction comes from?
In the legacy system, so we use ATCA based, so it's expensive hardwares and very integrated softwares. So we try to decouple the software and the hardware. So that means that we need to think about how to realize isolation between the software and the hardware for the long-term operations.
Well, that's probably a good segue into the question for our two technology suppliers then. So, of course, those of you that have seen rather probably too much of me over the last 5 years, I've been very keen on getting standards around this space as well, but I'm not ignoring open source. We have a good open source story for the industry too. But for Anders, for Ericsson, what do you think are the benefits of standards?
First,
in
I would
this
like
space?
to say I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'm proud to be part of this activity. I've sat and listened to all the accomplishments in ETSI NFV over the last years here, and I see those are the main benefits, that the industry joins together between the operators and the technology suppliers. I like that word much better as well. So that we join together and provide an architecture and interface specifications to secure interoperability, because we are all providing different parts into the network, and to have that interoperability and to be able to, not only on high level, but also to ensure that through the plug tests, I think is one of the key benefits of ETSI NFV.
Okay, thanks, Anders. Geza, what's the Nokia view on the benefits of standards in this space?
Yeah, Don, first of all, big thanks for bringing this panel together. I think it was an excellent idea to mix vendors with our dear customers. So, first thing that comes to my mind is related to scope. So, let me explain. We in Nokia started the cloud management and orchestration related research activities and product development about 10 years ago. So that was well before the ETSI standards would have emerged. So we pretty much had to go out there and define our own scope for the products, go out and try to sell these products and services. So you actually needed to tell a story. You had to introduce the basic concepts to our customers. So the type of questions like, what is a VNF manager again? What did you say? Why do I need that? Do I really need to pay for that or invest in that? Was kind of a common question not so long time ago. And that's clearly not the case. And we can thank for the standards for that. So there seems to be now quite a wide consensus on architecture, information model, data model, even down at the API definition level. And I would like to emphasize this API consensus. This is essential for third-party integration and interoperability. Without that, there is no successful or only a very painful road for a true integration. So I would sum it up like the standards gave us a common language to talk to. So we finally could take these conversations to the next level, not to speak about the basics anymore, but really take the conversation to the next level, which is obviously evolution for the industry. And perhaps the last thing I would mention is really the standards are also, and this is probably a benefit more for the operators rather than the vendors, is standard tools for comparing different products and services, right? We all speak the same language. The products can be measured against standards, which is pretty black and white, right? You can almost do an apple-to-apple comparison. Of course, that's where the secret ingredient and long-term experience comes into play. All the vendors are trying to spice up their offering. I guess that's it, Don.
Anders, did you want to add anything to that, triggered by Geza's comment?
I do agree, as you say, that it brings a common language. I think that's what standards is all about. And I also maybe would like to say that we see that the ETSI NFV brings the architecture, but also around automation, lifecycle management, all these tools that is necessary for our industry, that is necessary to create a cloud platform that will take us into the 5G and the promises that 5G brings.
Yeah, of course, 5G is the big exciting new wave of technology where NFV is really going to play in a really important way, isn't it? I was quite interested in both of you talked about terminology. One of the first deliverables out of ETSI NFV was the terminology document, wasn't it? Trying to get the alignment around the industry. What is a VNF? What is a VNFD? What is a VNF manager? And I'm even now beginning to see some people trying to change things, right? Well, VNF becomes a CNF. Well, what's that about? I mean, I think just keeping a baseline and not trying to shift the narrative away and coming up with new terms. Personally, that's what I think we should be resisting. But that's a comment from the moderator that's probably out of order. Thanks a lot for those comments today. Yoshi, for Docomo, you're deep in the weeds of deployment. You personally have told me over the last year or two of the pain as well as the benefits of deploying NFV in the entity document network. What do you think are the priorities for standards going forward based on your experience?
Yes, so we believe NFV standard is a keystone to realize a multifunctional and a multi-vendor NFV environment. So open discussion and consensus-based API is good for operators because we can easily integrate many BNF in the common platform. And also, Etsy defined many architectures and, the unified architecture and interfaces. So that allows that we can produce the new services for the customers with a very short period. So that is a motivation for standardization.
Yeah, I have to acknowledge actually the excellent work, contribution by actually all of our panelists, but particularly Entity Docomo. Those of you earlier heard of Johan Trier from Docomo talk about the release of Etsy NFV, and I really want to call out Docomo's contribution and particularly Joanne's contribution to that. It's an amazing piece of work. Yossi, thanks for that. Geza, what do you think, from your perspective at Nokia, the priorities are for standards going forward?
Well, standardization is typically a slow and painful process, as we all know. So really the first thing that comes to my mind when we start speaking about standards is that we need speed. As I have just mentioned, a lot of us from the vendor community are in a position where we created products, we created working solutions even before the standards emerged. So in order for those standards to stay relevant, we really need to make sure that we can close them quickly and get them approved. So I'm especially referring now to stage 3 specs, down to the implementation level, API, interoperability level. Otherwise, what we have seen out there on the market is that many customers, many operators are impatient. They are not able to immediately collect the fruits of investing in these technologies and following the standards. And they suddenly feel the need to look at a different direction, maybe jump off the train, as I've put it. So indeed, try to close these standards quickly so that we can all turn to the implementation. But with all that, I do think that the standards are on a really good track with the Etsy NFV mono definitions. I think that there are many real-world problems that the standards are addressing. So we really need to be patient, implement the recommendations in those standards, and hope that we can really collect all these benefits. Now, I'm actually happy that I've seen the previous presentations today. And in terms of priorities, they are actually supporting the ideas I had also. There are industry trends out there like containerized VNFs, cloud-native architectures, or even other models proposed by ONAP and so on. So the Etsy standards need to be able to respond to that. We need to make sure that we are aligned. Sometimes at a first glance, we seem to bump into contradicting requirements and definitions in these different movements. And I would really like the industry to evolve rather than fight over these different alternatives. So we really need to make sure that we are not losing whatever we achieved so far as part of the standardization process. Then during the implementation, we bump into different gaps that are still there in the standards. So obviously, those need to be closed. Again, Tin and other colleagues mentioned a lot of topics that are currently under work in Etsy. So topics around the VNF configuration, they are a bit unclear. Every time we speak about how to configure the VNFs, all of us have a different understanding on day 0, day 1, day 2 configuration. What the hell is that? Where do I configure? The parameters that Tin flashed on his slide are again reflecting this kind of confusion. So, okay, I do need to configure my BNF, but how do I do that? What is the role of the element management system? What is the role of the mono stack and so on in this game?
Well, that's a topic that Bruno is going to come up right after this panel and talk about, actually, Geza. Anders, what have you got to add to Geza's points? Very good points there, Geza. Thank you.
No, of course, I definitely echo what you say about speed. I think if there is a benefit for standardization, it's just all about interoperability and the possibility, as you say, to pull together different products from different vendors into a complete system. But if there is a main drawback, of course, speed is. And so we need to speed up. I think also we need to focus on the interoperability. We need to focus on strengthening that even further and closing the gaps that we see. Focusing on the stage 3 definitions as well, so we get really down to the brass tacks. We're not just high level, but we're also specifying what is really required to make things work together. And in the same way, I also would like to ask for further focus on test specifications, because I think in standardization, we sometimes get a little bit too theoretical. We try to solve find the best theoretical way of solving things, and that's a challenge that we have, and is contradicted or driven from a better way in open source. I think also in standardization we need to get down to the test specifications, and we need to further evolve the plug tests to really make sure that our products fit together, not just on paper but in reality. And then finally, I think it's important not to over standardize. We've done a little bit of that in previous history, and I think we should embrace and use either the actual standards or the de facto standards that are out there in the ecosystem, and just bring in and embrace them inside ETSI NFV and close the gaps. And then I see finally we need to actually also prioritize taking the bridging into cloud native applications. We now done a good framework for virtualized network functions, but as the next step we see for 5G, cloud native applications is absolutely necessary, and to create the mono framework for that is a strong point, could be a strong point for ETSI NFV.
That's really good, Anders. And Geza, I want to come back to you again on insights and implementation. In my career, I've been responsible for prototyping lots of different telecommunications networking approaches, and then we've gone into the standards domain, and then the suppliers, technology suppliers, feedback into the standards domain. It's a very painful process, isn't it? And when we started out on ETSI NFV, we didn't actually start out to develop standards, believe it or not. We started out with a remit to converge requirements for the industry, align terminology, get the discussion going. We didn't really deliberately set out to produce standards, and you mentioned stage 3. If somebody, Bruno, had said to me 4 years ago, Don, we're going to do stage 3 standards, I would have been completely and utterly surprised. But we now have stage 3 standards, APIs, data models, which I did not expect. I think you've said already a little bit about how valuable that is. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you see the dynamic between the standards process and the implementation imperatives for a technology supply? I think you mentioned the conflicting requirements. Yes, sure, those things happen. But how do you manage that process of the standard is somehow behind your implementation, or your implementation's not necessarily reflecting completely accurately the standard? What do you want to do when that happens? You've got a mismatch.
Well, I think first of all that many of us who are working in the telco domain, we have been spoiled by standards quite a bit. So I'm thinking about 3GPP and other standards in telco that existed and were stable since quite a long time now. So in many cases, those standards are very accurate, very down to the details. So you open up a book of 500 pages and you start implementing an API which is described bit by bit for you. And in many cases, that standard was available even before the vendors started their implementation in the field. So I think that's a typical pattern. But the world has changed. So we need to speed up. We all need to be more agile. And obviously, what you mentioned requires a lot of flexibility actually from all sides, not just from the vendors, but also from the operators. We all need to accept that it's a fast-moving world now. We need to have an iterative approach, The standards are not yet finalized, so nothing is completely carved in stone. There are a lot of vendors, like Nokia itself, who is bringing a lot of field experience into the standardization process. We all need to respect and appreciate that, because it's not just a theoretical exercise anymore. That feedback comes really from the field, from practical experience. That's very valuable, I think. But it also makes the standard to keep evolving. Like Tina and other colleagues mentioned, there is still work to be done there, and we need to simply create flexible and iterative implementations, be ready to push out the next release and the next release and the next release pretty fast, make a smooth upgrade so that we can really get the benefits of the newest topics that the standards are addressing.
Anders, how about you? And on the Ericsson side of things, it's obviously been quite a journey for Ericsson and all of the systems vendors over the last 4 to 5 years, watching this moving target somehow, and at the same time responding to pressure from operators to get prototypes, to get trials. How do you deal with that mismatch between the standard state and the demand for the products?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think, as you said there, yes, I think it's all about working together between vendors and operators, and I think we have some of our leading customers here on the panel, and we know together about the challenges that this journey entails. It's not only about technology either, it's also about a lot of operational changes. We talk about, you said, Diego, moving from CapEx to OpEx and focusing automation. I think that is also an organizational and operational journey for the technology suppliers as well as for the operators, and I think that's a journey that we need to take together. I think Ericsson is a leader in the industry. We have a full stack in-house, so we develop everything from hardware to orchestration. So that gives us a little bit of an understanding of the pains and the challenges inside an operator. But then we also learn much more, of course, when we do things together with our operators. And we see the challenges in the operability and trying to close them one by one. And I think we also need to feed that back into standardization as well, to make sure that the standardization is actually something that works in the real world.
Excellent, thanks. Well, I'm going to hand it back to the network operators to make some last comments before I hand the mic to the audience. So I'm hoping you're thinking up your questions, guys. We're going to have about 5 minutes at the end. Diego, key learnings for Telefonica on deployment.
Well, basically, I was just following the discussion, trying to take some notes. Basically, and this is something that I would like to stress, is that standards guarantee diversity. Standards guarantee that we are able to make different things to interpret, because never, ever one size will fit all, at all. Call it whatever you call it, and whatever you call it, open source or whatever, there will be some decisions, design decisions, coding decisions, that will not necessarily fit all your needs or all the needs of everyone. And that implies that you need diversity, and the only way to guarantee that diversity is by means of having standards. That is important, and this is something that we have learned as well. With all the evolution, it is important as well is that you have to bring to the right level of standardization. That implies that probably we are in the telco world too much used to very rigid, extremely detailed, as Jesus said before, architectures, and it's much better to go to the detail probably of just frameworks, leaving some freedom for design, and defining what is important, that are the interfaces and the objects that you exchange through the interfaces, but not to say, no, only this box can talk with this box using this. And, well, something that we have learned as well is that, yes, standards are slow, but what is slow is no standards. What is slow is consensus, whatever. You put 6 humans inside the room, and to make them agree takes time on whatever. Whether we are talking a standard for communication or we're talking what to order for dinner. Whatever, it's something that takes time. And what is important is that we live in a world in which things have to go very fast, and that we all try to follow the examples of the, which is the name, the EPTA or TERA giants, etc. That remember, they don't use standards. They impose what they do. They are one-headed solutions that are not required to interoperate to anything but with themselves. So that way, it's very easy. Having a dictator is very easy to converge and to reach consensus because you don't have the consensus. So it's slow, it's true, but we can accelerate this, and this is precisely practicalities, implementing, testing, striving for interoperability, running early tests is extremely important, and it's doable. We have demonstrated that it's doable inside the NFV group. Enough.
Anders, it looks like you want to say something.
No, I think you made a really great point there. It's about the consensus, and we see that also in both in standardization and as well as in open source. Even there, it's about consensus and getting the code together, and that also takes time. But I think it's a great remark.
Okay, Yoshi, last comments from you on NTT Docomo's. What do you think are the key learnings that you would like to pass the industry today?
Yes, so we think the standardization and detailed specs. So that means stage 3 specs is mandatory for easy integration for operators. So without that, so maybe you can develop your code in-house, but you need much money for integration, and you need to ask the many vendors to get the unified consensus. So I believe the standardization and the open discussion-based API is a key for the NFV future. So we think, so let's get together to define the future NFV networking. Yeah, that's all.
That's great, Yoshi. Thank you very much. Have we got questions in the audience? Of course you have.
Yeah, for sure.
The microphones, please. We've got 5 minutes for questions, and then...
I'm Mark Cohn, and I just want to come back to a point that Anders made earlier. Anders, you were mentioning that we need greater, broader testing specifications. And one thing that I'm reading between the lines is that it's not just about testing in this development sense, it's more about testing, validation, assurance. Those things now get more integrated in the virtualized environment. So can you elaborate what you were thinking about there and what some of the challenges that need to be overcome?
No, I think that the virtualized environment, as you say, opens up for speeding up the process of onboarding and validating the network functions on top of the cloud platform. And I think there we see that the operators need to embrace an automated environment for doing that onboarding and validation of network functions. And I see that the test specifications that are developed inside the Etsy NFV could be a base for such a automation tool as well.
Hi. Hey, Ramesh here. Just wanted to check on use case specific approach to developing the architectural requirements vis-a-vis, taking a generic architecture approach for all the possible use cases out there in NFV SDN environment. So I see this as a, time to speed that you are talking about. If you fix a use case like SD-WAN and say, this is the use case that we want to rush to and make it monetizable vis-a-vis an access, NG access or a 5G, which are out there, but if you pull it all together, then the architectural requirements become so huge that impacts the speed. So what is your consideration on that?
Can I make some comments on that one as well? I'm not in the panel. Quick answer to that one. Just on the Etsy NFV original scope. NFV 001 was the use cases. What we did with the use cases was we looked across all of the operators that founded Etsy NFV back in 2013, and we looked at what would be the technical challenges that span those use cases. We didn't attempt to implement an architecture that was universal for the use cases. What we said is, what is the fields of application and what are the fundamental requirements? And that's one of the reasons why Etsy NFV's scope is so bounded. It's bounded at the bottom layer. It produces a set of Lego bricks with which we believe, at least, you can build almost any use case. That's why Etsy NFV is quite narrow in scope, to prevent this bloated architecture that's attempting to do everything. That's my answer to the question, but please, panelists.
Just one reflection about scientific method. And you know, good engineering has to have a good science foundations. Scientific methods starts from experiments. You have experiments that are use cases. You develop the theory and then you apply the theory till when another experiment appears, you go and decide. The point is that the architecture is there because at the moment in which with the experimental facts we had, the ones we analyzed, the architecture was well suited. If in the future or not something else, and well, right now, last time meeting in NFV, we approved precisely the discussion of new use cases related, well, in this case, related with industrial environments. Well, let's see if we had to adapt the architecture, even rethink it completely. We are open to that. It's not that the architecture is carved in stone, and one of the advantages of the virtualized environment is that it's much more flexible than others.
Any other answers from the panel? That's a very good question, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention here. The term use case actually triggered something in my mind, and I'm not in particular thinking about larger use cases like SD1 or alike. But coming back to the standards, we seem to be facing an issue also with the competence. So not everyone is expert in the standards. And I think that in the ETSI standards, we could all use practical examples, like smaller use cases for certain things that the standard is trying to describe. And coming back again to the example that Tin was presenting about VNF configuration. So those attributes, modifier attributes, extensions and all that, they could all use practical examples. What is the real life use of these terms introduced by the specs? That's the only thing I wanted to add.
Yoshi, as far as entity Docomo is concerned, is your use cases, are they covered by the standards? Or do you feel that you're constrained in any way?
Yes, so we contribute our core network use cases for HANFV standard. So that means there are a lot of gaps exist. So we try to fill the gap with our knowledge and our use cases basis, API, sequence, parameters. Yeah, that is our approaches.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to our panelists. Thank you for the audience for listening. And I hand over to Tin again. Thank you very much, guys. Well done.